The following is an encore presentation of one of many Financial Sense Premium programs which are available every week to premium subscribers only. For more information on premium subscriptions, go to our financialsense.com website and click on the subscribe link provided.
The Financial Sense Midweek Edition with Jim Paplava. Delving in depth with authors and experts into the key economic issues.
It's considered one of the most powerful banks in the world, but it's a bank you've probably never heard of. But it's the central bank to the central bankers. Joining me on the program today is Adam Labor. He's written a new book called The Tower of Basel, the shadowy history of the secret bank that runs the world. Adam, the Bank of International Settlements, which is the bank we're talking about, is the most important bank in the world. It predates the IMF, the World Bank, yet hardly anyone has ever heard of it. And yet for decades it has stood at the center of the global network of money, power, in covert global influence. Why has it remained as anonymous as it has, and why are most citizens of the world oblivious of its existence?
It's a very good question, and it's one of the questions that made me interested in writing my book, Tower of Basel, because the bank was set up in 1930 for a very obscure reason, supposedly to manage German reparations payments for the First World War, the money that Germany had to pay victorious allies. But the real reason it was set up was to have a place where central bankers, that's the governors of national banks, such as the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, Bank of France, and so on, could meet, far away from prying journalists and interfering politicians. And so the bank has managed to maintain a quite low profile through the decades, because it's a unique institution. It's a commercial bank. It's immensely profitable. It's got only 140 customers. Most of them are other central banks, but last year it made well over $1 billion, not a million, $1 billion. And it's also at the same time protected by an international treaty. So it has the same protections as the UN, or rather similar protections to the UN or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or the diplomatic embassy. So it's this really unique hybrid. And for many years it's operated very quietly behind the scenes.
To understand how this elusive bank wields such power today, Adam, could you give us a background of how the bank was created? You mentioned the original purpose for war reparations, but even beyond that, the men who were behind its creation.
The two key players who are behind the creation of the Bank for International Settlements were a man called Montague Norman, who was the governor of the Bank of England from 1920 to 1944, and a German banker called Hjalmar Schacht, who was the president of the Reichsbank, the German National Bank, and then became the president of the Reichsbank under Hitler, and was really regarded as the architect of the so-called German economic miracle when the German economy recovered under Hitler. He was a key player in the German economic reconstruction during the 1930s, but it allowed it to rebuild its economy and prepare to go to war during the Second World War. And they were the two people that really were the driving force behind the creation of the bank. Hjalmar Schacht even used to refer to the Bank for International Settlements as my bank. And then during the Second World War, BIS was so useful to the Germans that a man called Emil Pohl, who was vice president of the Reichsbank and the director of the BIS, even said that the BIS was the Reichsbank's only real foreign branch. What was fascinating about this was that during the Second World War, the BIS had an American president, a man called Thomas McKittrick. And during the war, the BIS was this kind of strange island where people carried on making money from all sides. You know, the president was Thomas McKittrick, the general manager was a Frenchman called Roger Audouin, and the assistant manager was a German called Paul Hechler, who was a member of the Nazi Party. And you can see his correspondence in the BIS archives, and he signs his letters Heil Hitler. So while all these countries are at war, these three gentlemen and others are all working happily together to keep the BIS going.
There was a special date, Adam, in the bank's history. It goes back to January 20th, 1930. The leaders signed an agreement that made the BIS the world's most privileged and protected bank. And as you pointed out earlier, it's a highly profitable bank, having made just a little over $1 billion last year. But it's really only accountable and controlled by its members, which are central banks. Explain that.
The BIS has 60 or so central banks as members. Countries aren't members of the BIS, but central banks are, including the Federal Reserve. And they are the shareholders in the bank and receive the bank's dividends every year. Part of its enormous profits are paid out as dividends. And each year there's an annual general meeting where they kind of discuss what's going on at the bank. But the real power of how the bank itself is run is decided by the board of directors. But in terms of accountability to you or I or other citizens, well, there isn't really any, as far as I can see. I mean, the banks and here's the contradiction, that the banks that are members of the BIS, such as the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, are public institutions. Their governors and their officials are paid out of the public purse by our taxes, and they're charged with managing the money supply and keeping the value of the currencies in all these countries. But there's no real connection between average citizens and the BIS itself. So my argument is that the BIS remains largely unaccountable.
I guess from the inception, why did the U.S. originally not participate in the bank, even though when you look at the bank's history, the first presidents were Americans?
The American relationship with the BIS is interesting and is quite contradictory and ambivalent. The BIS was born out of something called the Young Plan, which was the plan masterminded by Owen Young, an American businessman and diplomat, to oversee the reparations payments for the First World War for Germany in the late 1920s and in 1930. So the BIS has always had an American connection. And its first two presidents were American. Gates McGarrah was its first president. He was American. And then also during the Second World War, as I said, Thomas McKittrick was its president, and he was American too. And the bank had another American president as well. So there's always been this American connection. But at the same time, especially when you think of the United States during the 1930s, there's a really strong feeling that we don't want anything to do with international institutions. I mean, remember the United States joined the League of Nations, even though under Woodrow Wilson it kind of helped set the League of Nations up. So there was a fear that if they had anything to do with the BIS, it would be able to interfere in American domestic politics and economic policy making. So they didn't have anything to do with it. And the American shares were given to a tranche of private banks. But eventually, when the BIS's role changed in the 1980s and 1990s, and it became much more global, the Federal Reserve took up its shares. The Federal Reserve and also the Federal Reserve in New York are both members of the BIS now.
Adam, the bank had three reasons when it was originally set up. The first, and ostensibly the most important, was to manage German reparations. The second was to facilitate cooperation between central banks. And the third was to act as a bank for central banks. About 5 years into its existence, by 1935, it had already lost its primary reason for existence, and the second was under threat.
Yes, and that's an example of how the BIS has been so clever through the years, reinventing itself. It's a very agile institution. You know, when we think of international institutions like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund, we think of these huge lumbering beasts, you know, like cruise ships that take, you know, half a day to change direction. But the BIS is small and it's nimble, and it always had a very good radar as to what was going on. So as you say, yes, it was invented to mainly oversee German reparations payments, but they'd stopped by 1933. So really the bank didn't need to exist. So it reinvented itself partly as a place where central bankers meet. And also what's interesting about the BIS is that it's really the place where the global technocrats, the global financial technocrats were invented. And if you've ever wondered, how did we actually get to this position where these middle-aged men in suits are flying off to Athens or the developing world and whatever and telling them, you know, this is what you have to do with your economy? It started at the BIS. The BIS organized some of the first bailouts for Spain and Austria and Hungary during the 1930s. And so this is where it all began. And then Of course, during the Second World War, the BIS was a prime point of contact between the Allies and the Nazis for post-war planning, because even though the countries were at war, there was contacts going on as to how they were going to get the money flowing after the war, much of which ran through Thomas McKittrick. And there were strong attempts to close the bank down. Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, and Harry Dexter White, his assistant, one of his senior officials, pushed very hard for the BIS to be shut down at Bretton Woods in 1944. Bretton Woods was the conference where the planning was done for the post-war economy. But the BIS had very powerful friends in the Treasury Department, in the State Department. Alan Dulles was the head of the American intelligence operation in Switzerland, was a very strong friend of the BIS and was also a friend of Thomas McKittrick's, the bank's president. So the BIS survived and reinvented itself in the 50s, 60s and 70s as a place, again, where central bankers could meet, but also as a place where a lot of the planning was done for the single European currency. Because before the euro was introduced, the euro was introduced at the end of the 1990s. Most people thought it was something out of the blue. Oh, look, we've got this new European currency. But of course, there have been decades of planning and preparation for that. And a lot of the technical work was done at the BIS.
I want to discuss probably what is considered one of the dark periods in the bank's history, and that's the bank's connection to the Third Reich, from Schacht to the president and CEO of IG Farben. Explain that and how that evolved, because it was really considered one of the darker moments in the bank's history.
Yeah, it was the darkest moment in the bank's history, I would say, and that's why at the end of the war, Henry Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White and many others said the bank should be shut down. When the bank started, it was set up by Schacht, and Schacht was a director of the bank. And when he stepped down as president of the Reichsbank, the new president of the Reichsbank was also director of the bank, a man called Walter Funk, as was his deputy, a man called Emil Pohl. For some time, a German private banker called Kurt von Schroeder was a director of the bank, and so was a man called Hermann Schmitz. Hermann Schmitz was the boss of IG Farben. IG Farben was the giant German chemicals and industrial conglomerate that basically was the manufacturing, the key manufacturer for the German war machine. Without IG Farben, Germany couldn't have gone to war. And a subsidiary of IG Farben made Zyklon B, the gas that was used to kill the Jews. IG Farben also ran its own concentration camp at Auschwitz. It had its own kind of private corporate concentration camp where they manufactured Buna, which was artificial rubber, which was needed for tires, among other things. And so the BIS during the war was absolutely thoroughly entangled with the Third Reich. And after the war, a total of 5 BIS directors were put on trial for war crimes. And Schacht himself was eventually found not guilty, and the others were found guilty but served quite short terms. But there was a very strong sense, driven in part by Alan Dulles, that the priority was really to rebuild the German economy, that while dreadful things had happened, and the industrialists were part of that, the priority was to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and against communism. But if you remember, at that time, the Iron Curtain had just come down and half of the continent had been shut off and was ruled by the Soviets.
You know, another dark moment in the bank's history, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. Novel idea. He invades the country, annexes it, and then demands the annexed states supply the gold to pay for the loss of the territory. Now, prior to the invasion, Czechoslovakia's bank had shipped, I guess, their gold to England and the BIS. Why did the BIS give in to the Nazi demands and basically ship the gold or credit it to the Nazi account?
The Czechoslovakian government had sent, a kind of obviously anticipating that the country was in extreme danger, had transferred some of its national reserves to its account at the BIS, which was actually held at the Bank of England. And when the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia in March 1939, they marched over to the National Bank and held the governor at gunpoint and said, you order the BIS and the Bank of England to transfer your reserves to the German sub-account at the BIS. And they did so because they were threatened with death, basically, if they refused to obey. And anyone could have seen that such an order had been issued under duress. But for the BIS, and also very much for the Bank of England, and Montague Norman was key in this, as long as the paperwork went through, then the transfer went through. You know, the fact that this was done under duress, held at gunpoint, that this was the Third Reich basically stealing a country's national reserves. That didn't matter because the order had been made, and so the order went through and the transfer took place. It's caused uproar in Britain and a lot of concern in America as well. Not to mention, profound anger in Czechoslovakia, but the money was transferred, and so Germany gained a large amount of gold without having to fire a shot because of the bureaucratic mentality of the time.
You know, something that you talk about in your book is with the Czech affair, it really highlighted the bank's increasing sophisticated gold operations, which were growing in reach and importance, which is still part of the bank's operations today.
Gold has always been very important for the BIS. The BIS's official historian and Italian historian, Professor Toniolo, says that gold is part of the DNA of the BIS because in the 1930s, the transfers and the financial transactions that the BIS were doing, many of them were done on the gold standard, and there was this idea, gold holds a special place in our psyche, really, that for many of us, gold is the ultimate store of value. And even now, the BIS has substantial reserves. I believe it's the country in the world with the 30th largest reserves, so something like 119 tons. It's got more gold than Qatar and Canada. And the BIS also does a lot of gold swaps for other central banks. So gold's always been very important to the BIS and remains so.
Something that when the war broke out, the management of the bank were facing three options. They could liquidate the bank, downsize and become dormant until the end of hostilities, or remain as active as possible. Tell us a little bit about that, because they were looking ahead to basically what happens after the war. In other words, the reconstruction that would follow.
As I said, the BIS managers have always been very clever at realizing which way the wind is blowing. And they could see, virtually as soon as the war started, or even before it started, that this war is going to carry on. It's going to be awful, and people are going to die, and countries are going to be laid waste. But after that, trade is going to have to restart. And maybe they're going to invent something new like the World Bank or the IMF, but they won't have any experience. Whereas we've been here for 15 years, and we know all about moving money between countries and central banks and the global economy and how that works. So they worked very hard to make sure that the bank survived. I mean, they thought that the best thing to do, it really was the only choice, is, downsize, keep quiet, and let's just survive, and then we'll rebuild after the war. But during the war, they did some terrible things. They accepted looted Nazi gold, and they also did some more subtle things, such as essentially recognizing the Nazi puppet regimes when countries invaded, when the Germans invaded a country like Belgium or Poland. They set up a puppet government to say, that to have the fiction that that there's some kind of local input into this to different degrees depending on the country. And the BIS recognized these puppet governments. Instead of saying that, we don't recognize you because you've been invaded by the Germans, they did recognize them. So the BIS did a lot to ensure that the Third Reich, that Nazi Germany, could continue functioning in the wartime global economy.
I want to talk about and move on to its president, McKittrick. And, he gave a prediction that he made that was almost like a prophecy that turned out to be true when he was talking to one of the individuals in Germany, that he had this feeling that something would happen that would get the U.S. involved. And I think, was it Poole who made the comment? He said, "My God, if you're right, we've lost the war."
Thomas McKittrick was extremely well connected. He was an American lawyer and a banker who lived in London for a long time before he moved out to Basel. And he had very good contacts. He was especially very well connected to Allen Dulles. Now, during the 1930s, Allen Dulles was a lawyer for a company called Sullivan and Cromwell, as was his brother, John Foster Dulles. And Sullivan and Cromwell was really a key point in channeling a lot of American money to Nazi Germany, to local governments, to companies, to sort of sorting out American investments in Germany. Now, to be fair, other countries were doing this as well. I mean, Britain, lots of British banks were doing that as well, and all sorts of countries were doing business with Germany. But there's no doubt that Allen and John Foster Dulles were important players in the money channel that ran from Wall Street to Berlin. And so where the money is usually where there's very good political intelligence as well. So McKittrick realized that, America is going to enter the war sooner or later. And when he told Emil Pool that, and Emil Pool was the vice president of the Vice Bank, as you say, he realized that really once America enters the war, it's all over, because Germany can't beat America.
I want to move forward to the modern world. The bank began as a depository, and then all of a sudden it also began to accumulate a large body of data, of statistics on banking, making it one of the best informed financial institutions in the world. And especially when you deal with cross-border banking transactions and the flow of international capital. In fact, its annual reports are must-reading for people that are in the Treasury Department or the heads of central banks.
That's certainly true. All through the years when the bank was set up in 1930, it's always had very good information sources. And right from the start, its annual reports were really extraordinary compilations of analysis and research and information. And nowadays, they're absolutely regarded as essential reading. As you say, they have all sorts of information about the international financial markets, about the global economic situation, and they have policy prescriptions, which is an interesting point, because some people say that a bank like the BIS shouldn't be telling elected governments what to do. Other people say that be good research staff there, so that they have a right to free speech as well, so they can say whatever they want. And the interesting point is that the BIS, before the crash came, was one of the few institutions to warn that there's too much money sloshing around. There's too much easy money, especially in Asia. They didn't exactly say what was going to happen, but they said the situation's unstable and something needs to be done.
When you take a look at where the bank stands today, as you referred to earlier, Adam, in last year, I think the bank made almost $1.2 billion, which is almost a profit of $100 million a month, which is remarkable when you consider it only has roughly about 140 clients. Let's talk about the role of the bank today. How does it figure in when you have the IMF, you have the World Bank? Where do you see, let's say, the bank going in the future? It seems like it has this innate ability to sort of reinvent itself.
Absolutely. I mean, the BIS was founded as a very Eurocentric institution, for dealing with German war preparations. And then during the 30s, it was very focused on Europe. And then during the Second World War, it was focused on Germany as well. And then during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was focused on Europe again and the very first early planning for the euro. But then after the European Central Bank was set up, and the European Central Bank grew out of the BIS, it was before the European Central Bank was set up, it was called the European Monetary Institute and was based at the BIS. So the ECB is really the son of the BIS, to pile up those acronyms. But then after the ECB was set up, the bank realized, what are we going to do now? Because the European financial work is being done by the ECB. So they became much more global and they opened up. And Russia is a member now, China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the Philippines, and so on. But the bank doesn't really reflect the global economy. I mean, there's only 2 African countries that are members of the BIS now. Algeria at the top of the continent and South Africa at the bottom. So Nigeria is not a member, Kenya is not a member. Countries that are regarded as stable and reasonable successes, such as Ghana and Botswana, are not members. Also, a number of Asian countries are not members. Pakistan is not a member. Kazakhstan is not a member. But all the little new European countries that popped up after the collapse of communism, like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Macedonia and Slovakia, they're all members. So there's still a lot of question marks over the way the bank is structured and the way that it's operating.
Where do you see the BIS in the future? Do you see it as powerful a bank as it is today? I mean, once a month you have all the major central bank heads meet in Basel each month. I mean, do you see it playing an integral role with the financial system going forward?
Absolutely. The key point about the BIS is it's a kind of hosting place and a meeting place. It's every other month, the 60 central bankers travel there for something called the Global Economy meetings and other allied meetings where they discuss the global economy. And so, you've got Ben Bernanke from the Federal Reserve, Mark Carney from the Bank of England, Mario Draghi from the European Central Bank, and they're holding a lot of high-level discussions to do with managing public money supplies, and we have no idea what they're saying. No information about these meetings is released. And at the same time, the bank hosts some very important committees and organizations, such as the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. Now, that sets the rules for commercial banks, not for central banks, but for commercial banks, which is broadly along the 8% line, which is that if a bank is lending out $100 million, it has to keep $8 million in assets, just in case its loans all go wrong. And so that is hosted at the BIS, as is something even perhaps more obscure but also very important, called the Financial Stability Board, which is also hosted at the BIS. Now, that coordinates central banks and regulatory authorities. So the idea is to, avoid any more future crashes such as we've had recently. So there's a lot of very important things going on at the BIS, and it's going to be more and more a central pillar of the global financial system, I think.
There's been a lot of talk, Adam, that someday that, with these large currency blocks that we're seeing, the dollar block, the euro block, and now there's even talk of an Asian block, of eventually going towards a global currency with a global central bank. Could you see the BIS playing that role?
Well, if there was a global currency, and the BIS does actually keep its accounts in something now called SDRs, Special Drawing Reserve, which is not really a currency, but it's like a unit of accounting. But the BIS accounts, which, and let's give it credit, you can download its annual report each year and see its accounts for nothing at the BIS website. But they are kept in SDRs. So if there was a global currency, the BIS would be the natural place for that. But frankly, I can't see a global currency ever happening, especially after what we've seen with the euro, because the lesson of the euro is extremely clear that if you have countries with very disparate fiscal policies, policies to do with tax and public spending, and also mentalities such as the difference between the approach to paying tax in Germany and that in Greece, Cyprus and Italy, all shackled together in the same currency, well, it simply doesn't work. Or if it does work, it has an awful lot of contradictions, costs and stresses. So I think the idea of having a global currency, where, for example, Thailand is linked to Brazil and is linked to Canada all in the same currency, I don't see that happening. Because the lesson of the euro and the lesson which the BIS has taught us through its work in constructing the euro is that, common currencies, in my opinion, between different countries simply don't work unless those countries have very similar fiscal policies and attitudes towards paying taxes.
Adam, one of the things that always surprised me, and in fact, this goes back to the 90s. I can remember as a money manager at one time, we actually owned the shares of the Bank of International Settlement, but then, of course, they went private. Can you explain what happened there?
Yes, there were some shares floating around in private hands. Dating back to the 1930s, some of the American banks had sold them, and one or two of the central banks had sold their shareholdings, or, part of them. And they were in private hands, and then eventually the BIS said, we're going to buy them back. And because they're an international organization, that couldn't be contested. No, it's like you can't really sue the BIS in any court because no court will recognize the jurisdiction over it. But there is something called an arbitration tribunal, and the BIS went to the arbitration tribunal together with the people. Their shareholders weren't contesting the BIS's right to buy the shares back, but they were certainly contesting the amount of money that the BIS wanted to pay. And the settlement said that the BIS had to pay substantially more than they'd originally offered. And the BIS paid that. But it's a shame because those people who own BIS shares have lost a very nice source of income.
Adam, as we began this conversation, the bank maintains it's not secretive, and yet if you were to go to the average American or European or average world citizen and ask them if they've ever heard of the Bank of International Settlements, they'd probably draw a blank. So are they secretive, or are they open, or why haven't most Americans heard, or for that matter, anybody heard of the Bank of International Settlements? Very few people know about it.
The BIS likes operating quietly behind the scenes, and that's how it was born. It was born in an age of authority, deference to authority, and people not really questioning those who believe that they knew better. So that's been part of the way that the banks run through the years. And nowadays, it still maintains a lot of secrecy. For example, the bank wouldn't tell me who its customers were. No, it says that we have 140 customers, but it wouldn't say who they are. its banking operations are secret. It says that they told me that they strive to, keep to best practices with regard to banking secrecy and confidentiality. So we don't know that. We don't know what the central bankers talk about when they meet there every 2 months. We don't know what those discussions are about. We don't even really know who attends them, although we can have a good guess. At the same time, the BIS has made some steps towards opening up. Its archives are open. The archivists and the historians there were very helpful to me. The archives are open under the 30-year rule. As far as I could see, all the material about the Second World War was there. I found some documents which really did not show the bank in a good light at all. They were freely available to me, and there was no problem about getting hold of copies of them. But at the same time, the bank has also modernized somewhat. I mean, it has a website, and there is some information on the website about how the bank operates, and you can download all its annual reports back to 1931 for free in, I think, 2 or 3 different languages. So there's been movements, but still the essential core of the bank's operations remain as highly confidential.
Yeah, it's amazing that as large as they are and as much money as they make, they pay no taxes. Nice situation.
They pay no taxes, they pay no corporation tax, and the people that work there pay no income tax. So it's a very popular place to work.
Well, listen, Adam, you've written a fascinating book, and you've brought to light a lot of information about one of the most powerful banks in the world and one that is yet unknown to most citizens of the world. The name of the book is called The Tower of Basel, The Shadowy History of the Secret Bank That Runs the World by Adam Labor. Adam, I want to thank you for joining us on the Financial Sense News Hour.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a great discussion.
As we began that conversation with Adam in his book, I can remember back in the 90s, we actually owned shares in the Bank of International Settlements. They were going roughly for about $10,000 a share. We bought them as a value play because they were worth more than that when you take a look at the gold reserves of the Bank of International Settlement. And here's an organization that had profits but paid no taxes, and yet it's at the center or epicenter of the world's financial system. If you want to learn more about the BIS, highly recommend you read the book. It's very authoritative, a lot of good documentation in it, and once again, it's one of the most powerful central banks in the world, and if you ever have a chance to read their annual report, it's very informative, especially when you take a look at cross-border capital flows and what goes on in international finance. I'm Jim Poplava. Thanks for listening.
You can subscribe to Financial Sense News Hour in the iTunes and BlackBerry podcast libraries or at feeds.feedburner.com